Bring in the attorney who argued against Obamacare on behalf of Texas and scored that big win on Friday, Robert Heneke, and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General John Yoo. Welcome to both of you.
Shannon, hi. Thanks for having me on the program.
Okay, so let's play a little bit of bipartisan reaction to that ruling. This is the Senate's top Democrat and also Republican Susan Collins.
It's an awful, awful ruling. We're going to fight this tooth and nail. And the first thing we're going to do when we get back there in the Senate is put a vote on the floor urging an intervention in the case.
I think this will be overturned on appeal.
You do?
I do.
Okay, Robert, let's talk about that, because first this goes to the Fifth Circuit, which is viewed as generally middle of the road, maybe leaning conservative a little bit, and maybe all the way to the Supreme Court. What do you make of the prognostications on both sides of the aisle that it won't stand up?
Well, the critics are wrong. Federal District Judge Reed O'Connor got it right. He got it right because he followed the statute, the text of the Affordable Care Act. He followed the language of the Supreme Court when it ruled Obamacare could only be constitutional because the tax penalty generated revenue for the federal government. Now that that penalty has been zeroed out, the individual mandate, which has always been recognized to be unconstitutional in the abstract, remains. It was right for the judge to recognize that, and it was also right for the judge to strike down the entirety of the act, because it would have been judicial activism for him to just cherry pick bits and pieces of the act that he wanted to keep or set aside. That's not his job. He did his job. Now the case moves forward.
Okay, and to remind folks, back in 2012, when the Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act, it did so finding the individual mandate to be a tax. So in the tax law last year, it was zeroed out. It is to zero. It still exists, but, you know, this judge essentially saying at that point, it really cannot, the rest of the law can't hold up. So there's this question about severability, where you keep the parts of the law that can survive and get rid of those that can't. This is part of Judge O'Connor's decision. He says Congress stated many times, unequivocally, through enacted text signed by the president, that the individual mandate is essential to the ACA, because rewriting the ACA without its essential features beyond the power of an Article III court, as Robert just said, the court thus adheres to Congress's textually expressed intent and binding Supreme Court precedent to find the individual mandate is inseverable from the ACA's remaining provisions. John?
First, I think the court did get it right on the individual mandate. It is unconstitutional because it was based on the tax power, and that's gone now. The tax has been zeroed out, as you said, Shannon. Severability is very difficult. I have a lot of sympathy for the idea that the whole law would fall because the individual mandate is now unconstitutional. It's so intertwined in the law, and Congress may not have intended it to be struck out as a piece and keep everything else. The problem is that in 2012, when this case went to the Supreme Court, that view that the whole law should be struck down was held by the four dissenters, Kennedy, Thomas, and Alito, and Scalia. That means, I think, that it's likely to fail on appeal because the five, as you said in the report, four of the justices, actually the five justices in the majority who upheld Obamacare and rejected this severability argument are still there on the court. Unfortunately, I think Chief Justice Roberts is probably likely to avoid wanting to make a sweeping decision striking down the whole law, which led him to uphold Obamacare twice, to the disappointment of me and many other conservatives.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so you know a number of groups are weighing in. Of course, Democrats, no surprise, but outside groups too. The president of Planned Parenthood saying this would take away health care from millions and is a direct attack on anyone who can't afford basic health care. This would especially harm those who already face systemic barriers to care, like people with low income, people of color, people living in rural areas, and immigrant communities. So, Robert, what do you make of that criticism? Does it change your feeling that the law needs to go as it stands?
Well, there needs to be parallel paths, and that criticism is misplaced. Let's recognize that Obamacare has failed. You've had 200% increase in premiums. You've had millions of people who have lost their health insurance because they can't afford it. You have people who have lost their doctors because it won't be covered by one of these Obamacare-type plans. The system is crumbling. It was doing so long before this ruling. But while the case works its way through the appellate courts, I think the important pivot point is to now pivot to get the policy right. And we need to not look to Washington, D.C. to be the solution on this. Instead, we need to look to the states. We need to look to the states to stand up and use market-based solutions to make sure that those who are sick can get care, can afford care, and can get that care from the doctors that they choose. Let's look for the right solutions, not just the partisan rhetoric, and recognize that Obamacare has failed. We need to find a path forward, and that's going to be from state leadership.
All right, John, quick final word to you.
I couldn't agree more with the policy objections to the law. The problem is those decisions should be in the hands of Congress. And I don't expect in the next 2 years a Democratic House and a Republican Senate are going to be able to pass anything with Obamacare, which unfortunately kicks the football into the arena of the courts, the last institution, I think, that should be making decisions on how health care should look. And the other thing we are overlooking is also puts in the hands of the executive branch agencies. President Trump and his Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, have a lot of discretion to shape how the health care system is going to work for the next 2 years.
That makes a lot of folks uncomfortable, and this kicks this also into the 2020 election, so we will see. Robert and John, thank you both very much.